The College of Ag could never. The College of Ag just sends you to like a vet school and like.
Oh no, I skipped a page somehow.
That's the worst. I would have to rip it out.
I'm ripping it out.
Okay, yeah. I can't have a blank page like that.
Well, then the worst is when you skip a page, but like you have the front and back of the two sides, so you can't
Oh,
actually
that's why I
rip it
don't
out.
want front and back.
Yeah.
You don't want
I
to
don't.
come back?
I don't like to seedle words
You
through it.
wasteful swine.
You know what?
All right.
Conflict mediation.
So let's jump in and talk. I'm actually going to look at my notes for this one because I don't want to stray too much. So we're going to talk about land tenure and conservation. So land tenure is like the process by which like ownership or occupancy is designated for land. Like, do you own it? Do you lease it? Is it owned by the government? Etc. So, I mean, it sort of ties into the head-tail theory, like I talked about. Traditionally, people were sort of moving around. Again, with the Berlin Conference, all of those people groups pretty much got, like, frozen in place. The colonial administration said, all right, you know, we're going to demarcate this area is for the Hehe, and this area is for this group of people. And then they also, on top of that, like, part of it was for, like, if you have a organized central government, you have to have some sort of a way of like knowing who's where. Part of it is also, right, so that they can allocate the uses in particular areas. So like they can, the really rich fertile land they can give for a particular type of purpose. But they also, particular into what we're interested in talking about, is creating these like conservation areas and how we conserve natural resources. So the Germans had three different types of like land tenure. They had freehold titles. So basically, like if you're a freehold title owner, it's kind of like our Western idea of like you have a deed to the land and it's yours. You have a leasehold, so you can lease it from the government, lease it from the. In this case, it would be the what do you call it? The Emperor of Germany. What was his name? Kaiser. Yeah, from the Kaiser. You could lease it from the government for use. And then the third type was customary tenure for natives. So typically freehold and leasehold were for colonial, like Europeans who were coming into the colony. And then the customary land tenure were sort of almost like reservations that were set up. Like, you are a native occupant of this land, you can have this land to live on. And the British, when they took over, converted all of those titles to British law, which essentially just transitioned it. If you owned it under the British, under the German government, you owned it under the British government. But then all unoccupied land under the British mandate was centralized, so that it was said like the government owns all of this land. If you want, so at this point there's lots of unoccupied land, and if you wanted land, you could go to the government and apply for a lease from the government for 100 years to occupy and use a land for a particular purpose. So that's British. When independence occurred, all of those freehold titles, which were, you know, like a Western idea of ownership of land, were converted to government ownership. So they said, you no longer, you know, under a socialist mode of production, the government owns all of these resources. You can lease it and use it. So if you, like in Daraquai, right, that title was no longer a freehold, it was turned into a 99-year lease from the government. So that continued throughout independence and continues to be true today. So like in Daraquai, when I said Peter Jones bought the land from South African Brewing, he bought the lease on the land. So the government still technically owns the land, but Peter Jones has the right of occupancy and use for 99 years. And this ties back into like people's perception and how they think about resources and how they think about the land, because there's the idea of like private ownership of land, private ownership of animals, like wildlife, there's not that sort of idea of a right to that private ownership. It's a much more of like a central organization. Okay.
I have a question
Yes.
about that. So since technically you don't own the land, do you have to like get approval to do things on it? Like let's say you want to farm or
Yes. So if you want to change what you're doing, so when you purchase the land, right, when you purchase the lease, you have to have like a land management plan. And if you want to change that, you do have to go to the government and explain why you want to make that change, and they have to approve it. So like actually, so Simba Farm is the farm where Dr. C and I were staying the other day. They're a big barley production farm, and they are one of those old freehold titles under the German and British colonial government that was converted to a lease, and it was purchased by a Dutch man at independence who stayed here all through Ujamaa and farmed that land. So his grandkids now are still owning the land, and they want to downsize the farm. So they want to subdivide and sell off different sections of the land because they don't. There's a lot of pressure right now because that's a huge area, and there's a lot of pressure for land for people to use. So partially, they want to downsize what they're doing as a farm and make the farm smaller, but they're also wanting to be good neighbors. But in order to sell off that land, they have to go to the government and say, this is what, we want to subdivide and sell off these plots. And then the government, so they're still designated for barley production, right? So if a local person wants to buy one of those plots of land, they're still by the government required to grow barley on a certain percentage of it, because that's what the land is designated for.
And the government sets the price.
Yeah. Yeah. All of the land is not. There's no private land sale. It's all based on government assessed value, on a number of different criteria. So it's a very different, like I sort of said that I think it's kind of difficult to emphasize like how that conception of private ownership, like how that and like the different conception of private ownership, how that affects a huge amount of the way that people just like think about the way that they organize their life. It's just, something that you don't think about subconsciously. Just like all of us, like we don't think about the fact that we I own these binoculars, I own this phone, I own a house in Pennsylvania and with land. Like I don't think about that. It's just sort of the way that I think about the world. And I think in the same way, people here don't really think about land tenure or their like right to access resources, but it's just like baked into the way that they think about their world, their worldview.